In the year 1576, Antwerp's Spanish garrison, angered by its lack of pay, sacked the very city it was supposed to be protecting. The looting of churches and monasteries did not endear the Spanish to their Catholic subjects in the Habsburg Netherlands. 13 of the 17 provinces joined the rebelling Holland and Zeeland in the pacification of Ghent, with William the Silent, the Prince of Orange, as the coalition of disgruntled provinces' de facto leader. The Spanish had managed to lose all but Luxembourg and Namur. The provinces demanded the withdrawal of Spanish troops from the Netherlands. All refugees on both sides were allowed to return to their homes and restoration of their property. William of Orange was reinstated as Stadtholder of Holland and Zeeland, restoring him to good standing with the Habsburg monarchy. And finally, Holland and Zeeland are allowed to be Calvinist provinces. The official religions of the other 15 provinces was to be decided by their states generals, with no religious persecution. This last condition was unacceptable for Don Juan of Austria, the Spanish Governor-General of the Netherlands at the time. He attempted to accept all but the final condition, keeping his disapproval secret from Holland and Zeeland. This naturally angered the deeply Calvinist states. This would be the beginning of the end of the pacification of Ghent. One locality which was never particularly happy with the pacification of Ghent's moderate position towards the Spanish and Catholicism was Ghent. Prior to 1540, the city council of the city of Ghent had a tripartite power-sharing system. There were 13 seats on any bench of city governments in Ghent. The Weavers' Guild and a grouping of 53 smaller craft guilds both appointed 5 aldermen each to any bench. The rest of the seats were taken by burghers. The influence of guilds also extended to the roles of deans and jurors. The structure of the guilds themselves would also be reworked after 1540. Originally, the most prestigious positions in a guild were dean and juror. The dean was the first amongst the jurors, so to speak, also possessing political powers. The position of dean was elected from among Greek candidates nominated by the guild. Jurors would be chosen by guilds anonymously. However, the city of Ghent had revolted against the Emperor Charles V, and when Charles had retaken the city in 1540, he abolished a tripartite power-sharing agreement. The position of dean would also be abolished in the guilds, being replaced with the position of headman. The headman would also be the one to appoint the jurors. The craft guilds were obviously quite resentful of this fact. This resentment would fuse with the rise of Calvinism in Ghent, as many of the craft guild members would embrace the new creed. In 1566, Ghent was one of the centers of the first iconoclastic fury. The iconoclastic outbursts of 1566 were not taken by the Catholics of Ghent as a serious threat to their religion. Overly zealous displays of Catholicism were associated with the Inquisition, which was unpopular even among Catholics in Ghent. The Netherlands had particular views of the clergy that made reaction to the iconoclastic violence more subdued. Even amongst Dutch Catholics, the demand for reform within the church was high. The laymen of the Netherlands thought that the clergy were intimately tied to heresy. Only the clergy were allowed to deal with heresy, not the laymen, and heresy itself was seen as a punishment upon Christians, specifically ignorant and immoral clergy. Alba's heavy-handed reaction to the iconoclastic fury only did more to make the Catholics of Ghent sympathize with their Protestant neighbors. As we will see, the case of the Calvinist Republic of Ghent is a different story. One of Calvinism's strongest preachers in Ghent was Petrus Deiethanus. Deiethanus, prior to preaching in Ghent, preached as a pastor to the Dutch community of Frankfurt and the Palatinate. In 1566, Deiethanus would be one of the most active Calvinist preachers in Flanders and Brabant. But after the Spanish Catholic backlash to the iconoclastic violence of that year sent the Duke of Alba to the Netherlands, Petrus was again forced to work amongst the Dutch diaspora community. Petrus and other Dutch Calvinist preachers will be important in the story of Ghent's Republic. To return to the 1570s, because of the ecumenical nature of the pacification of Ghent, the Catholic nobles of the southern provinces were allowed to stay in power. These Catholic nobles and magistrates were still punishing Calvinists within their cities and fiefs. However, in 1577 and 1578, in the spirit of religious peace proposed by the pacification of Ghent, the magistrates of the Catholic cities of Flanders would grant spaces of worship for their Lutheran and Calvinist minorities. But by this point, the Calvinist population had become too radicalized. On October 28th of 1577, they would revolt. Petrus Deiethanus' firebrand preaching would whip the middle-class Ghenters into a zealous frenzy. The Duke of Aarschot, the Spanish governor of Flanders, was arrested. These radical guild members would form revolutionary committees, capturing the city. Lord of Ryhove and Jan van Hebesche would take political power in Ghent, with Hebesche as populist dictator. Ghent would become a militantly Calvinist theocracy modeled off of Calvin's Geneva. The tripartite system of allocation for the municipal benches were restored, and the other reforms of 1540 abolished. The guilds and their craftsmen would become politically ascendant in Ghent, while the patricians were disenfranchised. Over the period of Calvinist Republican rule, the standardized number of individual aldermen and families would double and near triple respectively. Following the example of Calvinist Brussels, Ghent would establish its own Council of 18. This Council of 18 would assist in governing the city, such as appointing captains for the citizen guard. The house of the abbot of St. Beude would become the administrative office for the Chamber of Accounts. Ghent would seek to export its revolution to neighboring cities in Flanders. Ghent would back revolts in the towns of Bruges, Courtrai, Oudenaarde, Hulst, and Ypres. There was an attempt to establish a Calvinist Republic in Lille, but this failed. Calvinism thus became a powerful political tool for the magistrates of Ghent as well as a religious creed. It allowed them to create a zone of control over the rest of Flanders. The Calvinization of Ghent was an intense and quick process. By the summer of 1578, the Republic was filled with 50 ministers of the Reformed religion. Of these 50 ministers, 30 of them were considered to be highly learned. This included the aforementioned Petrus de Athanas, who became the head of the Theological Athenaeum. The Theological Athenaeum of Ghent would soon become one of, if not, the most famous Calvinist seminaries of its time, surpassing even Leiden University. Foreign Calvinist scholars would flock to the city. Both Lambert Dano and Alexander Ratlow were French students of John Calvin. They would end up teaching philosophy, physics, and ethics in Ghent. Ghent would also be host of the first open synod of the Reformed churches of Flanders in 1578. 17 congregations sent delegates to Ghent to discuss the issues of the appointment of preachers to the provinces and measures to increase the unity of the Reformed churches. So thoroughly Calvinist was the government of Ghent that when Petrus de Athanas gave sermons, the bells of the city would announce it. The rapid expansion of the Reformed religion in Ghent naturally came at the expense of the Catholics of the territory. Those many erudite Calvinist teachers were brought in to take the positions previously occupied by Catholic ones, as an example. In 1578, Ghent, along with its fellow Calvinist city of Bruges, would take advantage of a case of sodomy among the Franciscans to expel not just the Franciscans, but all mendicants from the city. The convents would be destroyed after the trial. From May to July, the homes and convents of priests and nuns would be taken over by Calvinist laymen. The convent of the Franciscans would be turned into a munitions store. Ecclesiastical property in general during this period would be seized to serve as places of Reformed worship. In the February of 1578, it would be reported by the Vicar General of Mechelen that the people of Ghent had stripped the treasures and ornaments of multiple churches and monasteries such as St. Peter's and St. Bravo's. Church bells, metal candelabras, copper, and ironwork would be taken in these incidents and sent to Holland to be melted down for the war effort. The bells of Ghentish churches would be claimed to weigh 322,066 livres, but were still seized and melted down. In July of 1578, Ghent would use its influence on the city of Ypres to force them to accept companies of Ghentish soldiers. This would be followed by the demand that the Church of St. Nicholas be made available for the worship of the Reformed. Part of this process involved 2 Ghentish commissioners going into the church and removing all gold and silver objects as well as the bells of the surrounding district. All of this naturally caused complaints from the city of Ypres to the States General. Ypres was not alone. This was a common occurrence in all the towns in the Ghentish sphere of influence. Ghent would send out 120 commissioners to do this task throughout the country. In early 1579, Catholic worship would be banned. In February of 1579, the tower of St. James Church was broken into and its bell was tampered with. Calvinists would hold mock processions in which they would offer the Eucharist and holy water to animals or throw them into the street. In August of 1580, Frans van den Bossche, a member of the Libertine order, would point out that not only did Catholic prelates and monks remain in Ghent, they enjoyed government pensions. All of this would possibly cause a reaction from Catholic citizens of Ghent. Also in 1580, there were claims in Ghent of an attempted Catholic coup. It was claimed that Catholics were using code words and markings on their houses to show allegiances to coming royal troops. Such claims were no doubt informed by an attempted Catholic coup in Bruges. This coup was only defeated with force of arms, with those suspected to be involved in the coup and Catholic clergy being expelled. In 1584, the government of Ghent would make it so anyone who did not take communion in the Reformed Church would be expelled from the city. The earlier infractions against the Catholic faith would provoke quite the reaction from the Catholic magistrates of the South, particularly the Walloon magistrates. Combine this religious divide with the fact that the new Governor-General, the Duke of Parma, Alexander Farnese, offered to maintain the privileges of the Walloon magistrates as well as a general pardon for them. In January of 1579, the provinces of Artois, Hainaut, and French Flanders would sign the Union of Utrecht or Arras. Thus, those southern Walloon provinces would be brought back in the Habsburg hands. In response to this, the leaders of Ghent would propose a closer union between the provinces which still opposed the Spanish. On January 23rd of 1579, the provinces of Brabant, Flanders, Tournai, Holland, Zeeland, and Gelders would agree to establish the Union of Utrecht. The terms of the union stipulated none of the provinces making a separate peace with Philip II and to collectively defend their rights and privileges. However, despite their agreements to form a closer union with the southern Calvinist republics, the northern provinces were far from happy with the situation. The father of the fatherland, William the Silent, desired a union which would be composed of both Catholics and Protestants, something the Republic of Ghent clearly repudiated. In 1578, William supported legislation which guaranteed freedom of religion. Part of this was helping negotiate the re-entry of the community of St. Peter's to their convent after it had been damaged by the Reformed earlier that year. The abbot would be forced to accept an agreement which made it so he would have to compensate those who he was retaking the church from, placing their property under the authority of Ghentish magistrates, and most finally, not being allowed to ring the church bells at night or at other unwarranted times. But, at the very least, the father of the fatherland attempted to keep the peace between Catholics and Protestants. William's support of religious peace made the radical Calvinists of Ghent label him an atheist. In fact, in 1584, Petrus de Athanas would be arrested for claiming this about William. The northern Netherlands in general saw the radicalism in Flanders as worrying, dreading the idea that a similarly intolerant regime could take power in the north. They saw the radical Calvinism of the south as what drew the Walloons back into the Spanish fold and thus weakened the revolution. In 1597, Burgomaster Hooft would go on a tirade against the influence of refugees from the southern provinces, seeing their presence in the north as possibly jeopardizing the revolt in the northern provinces through spreading fanaticism and harsh treatment towards Catholics. However, the Ghentish Republic was not everywhere despised in the north. When Utrecht was first organizing its Calvinist congregation in 1578, the Athanas would stand with the Calvinists against Utrecht's magistrates, demanding the Calvinists be allowed the use of a church building. Utrecht would ask de Athanas to serve its church, but de Athanas declined. However, Petrus de Athanas would call in a favor from the city when he was arrested in 1584 in Utrecht. Part of the reason Utrecht of all places was so favorable to Ghent is because both had similar social structures. Both had a clear and intense divide between the guilds and patricians, which led to the Calvinists of both cities adopting anti-patrician sentiment, unlike Holland and Zeeland, where the revolt against Spain was dominated by the province's nobles. In Holland, at the same time, Catholics were considered as part of the body of Christians. In particular, in urban centers like Haarlem, there was civic symbolism which transcended confessional differences. Emblems on public buildings in Haarlem did not depict confessional particularities, instead focusing on general Christian ideas. This was not so in Ghent. There was more to the politics of the Republic of Ghent than just its religious policies. As has been previously mentioned, the tripartite system of allocation to the benches was restored in Ghent. This hurt the power of the nobles for the benefit of the guilds. In 1576, just prior to the Republic, the share of noblemen on the city council was 65%. The Republic would cause this to decline. From the period of 1540 to the Calvinist Republic, the four major families of Ghent, Betsy, de Gruterie, Trieste, and Danman, would fill 12% of the seats on the aldermen's benches. During the Calvinist Republic, this would be halved to 6%. Access to the guilds was difficult to gain as there was a rather high entry fee. The dictator, Jan van Hebesche, would ask the deans of the guilds if they would be willing to lower the fee of entry to be between 240 guilders to 360 guilders. Hebesche also proposed that the guilds allow entry to Protestant immigrants for 3 to 4 years. The guilds would, however, reject both of these proposals. In fact, it would be harder to gain access to the guilds during the period of the Calvinist Republic in Ghent than in previous and future periods in the city's history. Just as the Republic had restored the pre-Caroline election of aldermen and deans, it also restored the election of magistrates. There were 8 electors for the magistrates, 4 appointed by 3 members of the commune and 4 by the sovereign. In this case, the sovereign would be the States General, but Hebesche had very tense relations with them, so he just took on the task of appointing the 4 electors himself. This is what effectively made Jan van Hebesche a dictator. It should be noted that Ghent had more conflicts with the central government of the revolt than just its religious intolerance. The Republic refused to contribute taxes to the States General's army. Instead, it would raise its own mercenary army with that money. Hebesche was a man who admired Republican institutions both ancient and modern. Jan modeled his Council of 18 on the Ephor, Sparta, and Tribunes of Rome. The 18 would serve the role of checking the power of the ordinary municipal authorities. Hebesche was also inspired by Calvin's Republic in Geneva and the Swiss Confederacy. Hebesche wished to see a canton system take root in Flanders, something which the Ghentish established in his sister republics throughout Flanders may have been a step towards. Hebesche saw Calvin's Geneva as a thriving commercial power which he wished to emulate in Ghent. This Swissization was something his opponents would attack him over. Hebesche would also function like a populist strongman, attacking the patricians and their property. Hebesche's populist style did not sit well with Ryhove. Ryhove had preferred a more moderate religious policy, patrician governance, and unity with the States General. In 1578, the city council would take 2 loans. The first loan was for repairs to the wall of the city. The second loan was to pay the soldiers' wages. The second loan only targeted the wealthiest groups of the Republic, such as urban politicians. 4 out of 10 of the contributors to this loan belonged to the political establishment. The regime of Hebeshet and Dethenis would not last forever. The tension with William the Prince of Orange would come to be their undoing. Raihoved would obtain from Orange a commission to arrest Hebeshet. In August of 1579, William would enter Ghent to support Raihoved's effort to coup Hebeshet's government, relieving Hebeshet's followers of their positions. All of this was of course supported by the lower nobility and moderates in the city. William would disarm the Council of 18 with Hebeshet and Dethenis fleeing the city to the Palatinate. After this, Ghent would make it illegal to publish any material which attacked the Prince of Orange. This did little to reconcile either the radical Calvinists or Walloons to William. Even after the coup and legislation, there would still be anti-Orange literature. The Father of the Fatherland was accused in a publication in 1580 of being a tyrant, letting his wife be attacked, preferring foreigners, and changing his wife and religion without hesitation. Throughout this whole time, Farnese did not remain idle, waiting for more magistrates to just fall into his lap. Farnese would put into action a campaign which would see the destruction of the Republic of Ghent. In 1581, the Duke of Parma would formulate a plan to recapture much of the southern Netherlands. Parma believed that the blockade of the Scheldt River and occupation of the Flemish coast would force the rebels to surrender. Parma would begin putting this plan into effect in 1582. Parma would win a string of victories leading him up to Ghent. In 1583, the moderate faction in Ghent would fall out of favor due to military losses against Parma. Hebeshet and Dethenis would return to power in the city, re-establishing the dictatorship. They would end up opening negotiations with Farnese, replacing Calvinist officials with Catholic ones as a show of goodwill. Hebeshet believed that Philip II would allow some type of religious peace akin to what his father Charles V had allowed in the Peace of Augsburg. This would backfire on them. In March of 1584, Jan van Hebeshet would be arrested, and on August 4th he would be executed. A month before, William the Silent was assassinated. All of these would prove to be bad omens. Farnese's blockade would hurt Ghent's economy, which was reliant on trade and transport. In November of 1583, Alexander Farnese would capture Aalst, a territory on the road to Ghent. The city was defended by English troops. These English troops had not been sent bread for 3 months, let alone pay. The morale was so low they turned over the city to Farnese for a month's wages and food. With the fall of Aalst, the path to Ghent lay open. Farnese would cut off the supply routes to Ghent and starve it into submission. The Catholic Peter de Vos would negotiate the city's surrender on the 17th of September 1584. Farnese was more responsible for the negotiations for the reconciliations of the various cities he took from the Spanish king. The terms Ghent would suffer was up to him to decide. After hearing from the envoys of Ghent, Farnese decided to act with more clemency than he felt deserved. For the good of the city of Ghent, of course. When Farnese ceremonially entered Ghent, Philip's coat of arms and initials were paraded through the city. Farnese was represented by an actual figure of a human. The tripartite system of government would of course be abolished once more. After the fall of the Calvinist Republic, the number of noble aldermen would be consistently above 60% and reach 85% in 1592. The Habsburgs would be careful to not allow something like the Republic of Ghent to happen again. They would meticulously look for Catholic noble families to promote within the city's government. The Catholics Philip Trieste and Jacob Tacoen, men who led urban Catholic militias in the 1560s which opposed the Calvinists of the city, would be considered eligible for civil offices. Farnese would personally intervene in the matter of returning property to the Catholic Church. Alexander of Parma forced the city's magistracy to return the property to the clergy and pay for their renovations. Ghent would be turned into a bastion of the Counter-Reformation. This would be done through a combination of returning exiled Catholics and expelling Protestants. Philip II would convince the Pope to publish a bull which demanded exiled religious return to areas reconquered from the rebels. Hundreds of priests, nuns, magistrates, laymen, and laywomen would return to Flanders and Ghent. In March of 1585, the Council of Flanders returned to Ghent, being greeted by several honorable men and citizens. Farnese would implement a plan to expel Protestants so that they could not convert more people. The Protestants of the city were given 2 years to leave the city. Protestants in Ghent would complain the newly restored Catholic ruling class would implement heavier taxes on them than they did on Catholics. If they did not pay, they would of course be arrested. The rebel leaders of the city would only be pardoned if they paid for the restoration of Catholic churches. All of this led to a mass exodus from the city, with the city producing 15,000 Protestant emigrants. In 1585, Ghent would receive a horrible harvest. The price of grain rose and the people were reduced to eating trash. This combined with the war and its trade issues would lead to Ghent losing half of its population. The city's economy would not recover from the blockade until the end of the century. To add in my own opinion, this is probably the Calvinist Republic of Ghent's longest lasting legacy. While its utopian religious zealotry and populist dictatorship failed to last even 10 years, its calamitous outcomes would affect Flanders for decades. With Flanders a mess, the center of economic and cultural activity in the Netherlands would shift north, from the southern provinces to the northern ones, such as Holland and Zeeland. But even though the Calvinist Republic did not last for long, it was still an interesting experiment in religious radicalism and republican government, two things which are very common for this era but received little attention in the popular imagination. Whatever the case, I hope you enjoyed the video and thank you for watching.